The Soviet Navy. Voyenno-morskoy Flot SSSR, literally Military Maritime Fleet of the USSR, was the naval arm of the Soviet Armed Forces. Often referred to as the Red Fleet, the Soviet Navy was a large part of the Soviet Union's strategic plan in the event of a conflict with the United States, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or another conflict related to the Warsaw Pact. The influence of the Soviet Navy played a large role in the Cold War, as the majority of conflicts centered around naval forces. The Soviet Navy was divided into four major fleets: the Northern, Pacific, Black Sea, and Baltic Fleets. Under separate command was the Leningrad Naval Base. The Caspian Flotilla was a smaller force operating in the landlocked Caspian Sea. Main components of the Soviet Navy included Soviet Naval Aviation, Naval Infantry, and coastal artillery. Most of the Soviet Navy was reformed into the Russian Navy after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, while some elements became the basis of the Ukrainian, Azerbaijani and Georgian navies. Early history. Russian Civil War. The Soviet Navy was based on a Republican naval force formed from the remnants of the Imperial Russian Navy, which had been almost completely destroyed in the Revolution of 1917, the Russian Civil War, and the Kronstadt Rebellion. During the revolution, sailors deserted their ships at will and generally neglected their duties. The officers were dispersed armies, and others simply resigned, and most of the sailors left their ships. Work stopped in the shipyards, where uncompleted ships deteriorated rapidly. The Black Sea Fleet fared no better than the Baltic. The Bolshevik Revolution entirely disrupted its personnel, with mass murders of officers. The ships were allowed to decay to unserviceability. At the end of April 1918, German troops entered Crimea and started to advance towards the Sevastopol naval base. The more effective ships were moved from Sevastopol to Novorossiya Square. After an ultimatum from Germany, they were scuttled by Vladimir Lenin's order. The ships remaining in Sevastopol were captured by the Germans and then, after November 1918, by the British. On April 1, 1919, when Red Army forces captured Crimea, the British squadron had to withdraw, but before leaving they damaged all the remaining battleships and sank 13 new submarines. When the White Army captured Crimea in 1919, it rescued and reconditioned a few units. At the end of the Civil War, Rangel's fleet, a White Fleet, moved to Bizerta in French Tunisia, where it was interned. The first ship of the Revolutionary Navy could be considered the rebellious Imperial Russian cruiser Aurora, whose crew joined the Bolsheviks. Sailors of the Baltic Fleet supplied the fighting force of the Bolsheviks during the October Revolution. Some imperial vessels continued to serve after the revolution, albeit with different names. The Soviet Navy, established as the Workers' and Peasants' Red Fleet by a 1918 decree of the Soviet government, was less than service-ready during the interwar years. As the country's attentions were largely directed internally, the Navy did not have much funding or training. An indicator of its reputation was that the Soviets were not invited to participate in negotiations for the Washington Naval Treaty, which limited the size and capabilities of the most powerful navies. The greater part of the old fleet was sold by the Soviet government to Germany for scrap. In the Baltic Sea there remained only 3 much-neglected battleships, 2 cruisers, some 10 destroyers, and a few submarines. Despite this state of affairs, the Baltic Fleet remained a significant naval formation, and the Black Sea Fleet also provided a basis for expansion. There also existed some 30 minor waterways combat flotillas. Interwar period. During the 1930s, as the industrialization of the Soviet Union proceeded, plans were made to expand the Soviet Navy into one of the most powerful in the world. Approved by the Labor and Defense Council in 1926, the naval shipbuilding program included plans to construct 12 submarines. The first 6 were to become known as the Decabrist class. Beginning November 4, 1926, Technical Bureau No. 4, under the leadership of B.M. Malinin, managed the submarine construction works at the Baltic shipyard. In subsequent years, 133 submarines were built to designs developed during Malinin's management. Additional developments included the formation of the Pacific Fleet in 1932 and the Northern Fleet in 1933. The forces were to be built around a core of powerful Sovietsky Soyuz-class battleships. This building program was only in its initial stages by the time the German invasion forced its suspension in 1941. The Soviet Navy had some minor action in the Winter War against Finland in 1939–1940, on the Baltic Sea. It was limited mainly to cruisers and battleships fighting artillery duels with Finnish forts. World War II, the Great Patriotic War, building a Soviet fleet was a national priority, but many senior officers were killed in purges in the late 1930s. The naval share of the national armaments budget fell from 11.5% in 1941 to 6.6% in 1944. When Germany invaded in 1941 and captured millions of soldiers, many sailors and naval guns were detached to reinforce the Red Army. These reassigned naval forces had especially significant roles on land in the battles for Odessa, Sevastopol, Stalingrad, Novorossiysk, Tuops, and Leningrad. The Baltic Fleet was blockaded in Leningrad and Kronstadt by minefields, but the submarines escaped. The surface fleet fought with the anti-aircraft defense of the city and bombarded German positions. The US and Britain through Lend-Lease gave the USSR ships with a total displacement of 810,000 tons. The composition of the Soviet fleets in 1941 included 3 aged battleships, 7 cruisers, 59 destroyer leaders and squadron destroyers, 218 submarines, 269 torpedo boats, 22 patrol vessels, 88 minesweepers, 77 submarine hunters, and a range of other smaller vessels. In various stages of completion were another 219 vessels including 3 battleships, 2 heavy and 7 light cruisers, 45 destroyers, and 91 submarines. Included in the totals above are some pre-World War I ships, some modern ships built in the USSR and Europe. During the war, many of the vessels on the slips in Leningrad and Nikolaev were destroyed, but the Soviet Navy received captured Romanian destroyers and Lend-Lease small craft from the U.S., as well as the old Royal Navy battleship HMS Royal Sovereign and the United States Navy cruiser USS Milwaukee in exchange for the Soviet part of the captured Italian Navy. In the Baltic Sea, after Tallinn's capture, surface ships were blockaded in Leningrad and Kronstadt by minefields, where they participated with the anti-aircraft defense of the city and bombarded German positions. One example of Soviet resourcefulness was the battleship Marat, an aging pre-World War I ship sunk at anchor in Kronstadt harbor by German Stukas in 1941. For the rest of the war, the non-submerged part of the ship remained in use as a grounded battery. Submarines, although suffering great losses due to German and Finnish anti-submarine actions, had a major role in the war at sea by disrupting Axis navigation in the Baltic Sea. In the Black Sea, many ships were damaged by minefields and Axis aviation, but they helped defend naval bases and supply them while besieged, as well as later evacuating them. Heavy naval guns and courageous sailors helped defend port cities during long sieges by Axis armies. In the Arctic Ocean, Soviet Northern Fleet destroyers and smaller craft participated with the anti-aircraft and anti-submarine defense of Allied convoys conducting Lend-Lease cargo shipping. In the Pacific Ocean, the Soviet Union was not at war with Japan before 1945, so some destroyers were transferred to the Northern Fleet. From the beginning of hostilities, Soviet Naval Aviation provided air support to naval and land operations involving the Soviet Navy. This service was responsible for the operation of shore-based flot planes, long-range flying boats, catapult-launched and vessel-based planes, and land-based aircraft designated for naval use. As post-war spoils, the Soviets received several Italian warships and much German naval engineering and architectural documentation. Cold War. In February 1946 the Red Fleet was renamed the Soviet Navy, literally the Soviet Military Maritime Fleet. After the war, the Soviets concluded that they needed a navy that could disrupt supply lines, and display a small naval presence to the developing world. As the natural resources the Soviet Union needed were available on the Eurasian land mass, it did not need a navy to protect a large commercial fleet, as the Western navies were configured to do. Later, countering seaborne nuclear delivery systems became another significant objective of the Navy, and an impetus for expansion. The Soviet Navy was structured around submarines and small, maneuverable, tactical vessels. The Soviet shipbuilding program kept yards busy constructing submarines based upon World War II German Kriegsmarine designs, which were launched with great frequency during the immediate post-war years. Afterwards, through a combination of indigenous research and technology obtained through espionage from Nazi Germany and the Western nations, the Soviets gradually improved their submarine designs, though they initially lagged the NATO countries by a decade or two. The Soviets were quick to equip their surface fleet with missiles of various sorts. Indeed, it became a feature of Soviet design to place large missiles onto relatively small, but fast, missile boats, while in the West such an approach would never have been considered tactically feasible. The Soviet Navy did also possess several very large and well-armed guided missile cruisers, like those of the Kirov and Slava classes. By the 1970s, Soviet submarine technology was in some respects more advanced than in the West, and several of their submarine types were considered superior to their American rivals. The 5th Operational Squadron operated in the Mediterranean Sea. The squadron's main function was to prevent large-scale naval ingress into the Black Sea, which could bypass the need for any invasion to be over the Eurasian land mass. Flagship of the squadron was for a long period the Sverdlov-class cruisers DNV. Carriers and aviation. Large carriers were not needed to support the naval strategy of disrupting sea lines of communication. Moreover, among the armed services the Navy was lowest in priority in the consideration of the party's management. Premiers Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev considered aircraft carriers overly expensive, time-consuming, and vulnerable to attack. The Soviet Navy still had the mission of confronting Western submarines, creating a need for large surface vessels to carry anti-submarine helicopters. During 1968 and 1969 the MOSKVA-class helicopter carriers were first deployed, succeeded by the first of 4 aircraft-carrying cruisers of the Kiev class in 1973. Both of these types were capable of operating ASW helicopters, and the Kiev class also operated VSTOL aircraft. They were designed to operate for fleet defense, primarily within range of land-based Soviet Naval Aviation aircraft. During the 1970s the Soviets began Project Oriel, whose stated purpose was to create an aircraft carrier capable of basing fixed-wing fighter aircraft in defense of the deployed fleet. The project was cancelled during the planning stages when strategic priorities shifted once more. It was during the 1980s that the Soviet Navy acquired its first true aircraft carrier, Tbilisi, subsequently renamed Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union Kronstadt, which carries Sukhoi Su-33 Flanker D and MiG-29 fighters, and Ka-27 helicopters. A distinctive feature of Soviet aircraft carriers has been their offensive missile armament, again representing a fleet defense operational concept, in distinction to the Western emphasis on shore strike missions from distant deployment. A second carrier was under construction when the Soviet Union disintegrated. Construction stopped and the ship was sold, incomplete, to China by Ukraine. It was commissioned into the People's Liberation Army Navy in 2012 as Liaoning. Soon after the launch of this second Kronstadt-class ship, the Soviet Navy began the construction of an improved aircraft carrier design, Ulyanovsk, which was to have been slightly larger than the Kronstadt class and nuclear-powered. The project was terminated, and what little structure had been initiated in the building ways was scrapped. In part to perform the functions usual to carrier-borne aircraft, the Soviet Navy deployed large numbers of strategic bombers in a maritime role, with the Aviatsiya Voyenno-morskoy floater. Strategic bombers like the Tupolev Tu-16 Badger and Tu-22M backfire were deployed with high-speed anti-shipping missiles. The primary role of these aircraft was the interception of NATO supply convoys traveling the sea lines of communication between Europe and North America, and thus countering Operation Reforger. Submarines. Due to the USSR's geographic position, submarines were considered the capital ships of the Navy. It was submarines that could penetrate attempts at blockade either in the constrained waters of the Baltic and Black Seas or in the remote reaches of the USSR's Western Arctic. Surface ships were clearly much easier to find and attack. The USSR had entered World War II with more submarines than Germany, but geography and the speed of the German attack precluded it from effectively using its more numerous fleet to its advantage. Because of its opinion that quantity had a quality of its own, and the insistence of Fleet Admiral Gorshkov, the Soviet Navy continued to operate many first-generation missile submarines, built in the early 1960s, until the end of the Cold War in 1991. In some respects, including speed and reactor technology, Soviet submarines achieved unique successes, but for most of the era lagged their Western counterparts in overall capability. In addition to their relatively high speeds and great operating depths, they were difficult anti-submarine warfare targets to destroy because of their multiple compartments, their large reserve buoyancy, and especially their double-hull design. Their principal shortcomings were insufficient noise damping and primitive sonar technology. Acoustics was a particularly interesting type of information that the Soviets sought about the worst submarine production methods, and the long-active John Anthony Walker spy ring may have made a major contribution to their knowledge of such. The Soviet Navy possessed numerous purpose-built guided missile submarines, such as the Oscar-class submarine, as well as many ballistic missile and attack submarines. The Typhoon-class submarine are the world's largest submarines. The Soviet attack submarine force was, like the rest of the Navy, designed for interception of NATO convoys, but also targeted American aircraft carrier battle groups. Over the years, Soviet submarines suffered a number of accidents, most notably on several nuclear boats. The most famous incidents include the Yankee-class submarine K-219, and the Mike-class submarine Komsomolets, both lost to fire, and the far more menacing nuclear reactor leak on the Hotel-class submarine K-19, narrowly averted by her captain. Inadequate nuclear safety, poor damage control, and quality control issues during construction were typical causes of accidents. On several occasions there were alleged collisions with American submarines. None of these, however, has been confirmed officially by the U.S. Navy. Transition After the dissolution of the USSR and the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Navy, like other branches of armed forces, eventually lost some of its units to former Soviet republics, and was left without funding. Inventory Soviet Navy in 1990, 63 ballistic missile submarines, 6 Typhoon-class submarine, 40 Delta-class submarine, 12 Yankee-class submarine, 5 Hotel-class submarine, 72 cruise missile submarines, 6 Oscar-class submarine, 6 Yankee Notch submarine, 14 Charlie-class submarine, 30 Echo-class submarine, 16 Juliet-class submarine, 64 nuclear attack submarines, 5 Akula-class submarine, 2 Sierra-class submarine, 1 Alpha-class submarine, 46 Victor-class submarine, 6 November-class submarine, 3 Yankee SSN submarine, a per-mil 65 conventional attack submarines, 18 Kilo-class submarine, 20 Tango-class submarine, 25 Foxtrot-class submarine, 9 auxiliary submarine, 1 Balaga-class submarine, 1 Lima-class submarine, 2 India-class submarine, 4 Bravo-class submarine, 1 Luzos-class submarine, 6 aircraft carriers/aviation cruisers, 4 Kiev-class aircraft carrier, 2 Moskva-class helicopter carrier, 3 battler cruisers, 3 Kirov-class battler cruiser, 30 cruisers, 3 Slava-class cruiser, 7 Kara-class cruiser, 4 Krista-I-class cruiser, 10 Krista II-class cruiser, 4 Kinder-class cruiser, 2 Sverdlov-class cruiser, 45 destroyers, 11 Sovremen-class destroyer, 11 Upyaloy-class destroyer, 18 Kashin-class destroyer, 3 Kanin-class destroyer, 2 Kuldin-class destroyer, 113 frigates, 32 Kryvak-class frigate, 1 Kony-class frigate, 18 Merkur-class frigate, 31 Petya-class frigate, 31 Rega-class frigate, 124 corvettes, 10 Parkim-class corvette, 36 Nanuchka-class corvette, 78 Grisha class corvette, 35 amphibious warfare ships, 2 Ivan Rogov class landing ship, 19 Rapucha class landing ship, 14 Alligator class landing ship, 6 Polnokny class landing ship, a Permil 425 patrol boats. Soviet Naval Aviation equals. The regular Soviet Naval Aviation units were created in 1918. They participated in the Russian Civil War, cooperating with the ships and the army during the combats at Petrograd, on the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, the Volga, the Kama River, northern Dvina and on the Lake Ongar. The newborn Soviet Naval Air Force consisted of only 76 obsolete hydroplanes. Scanty and technically imperfect, it was mostly used for resupplying the ships and the army. In the second half of the 1920s, the Naval Aviation Order of Battle began to grow. It received new reconnaissance hydroplanes, bombers, and fighters. In the mid-1930s, the Soviets created the Naval Air Force in the Baltic Fleet, the Black Sea Fleet and the Soviet Pacific Fleet. The importance of naval aviation had grown significantly by 1938 to 1940, to become one of the main components of the Soviet Navy. By this time, the Soviets had created formations and units of the torpedo and bomb aviation. Soviet Naval Infantry equals. During World War II, about 350,000 Soviet sailors fought on land. At the beginning of the war, the Navy had only one brigade of Marines in the Baltic Fleet, but began forming and training other battalions. These eventually were, 6 Naval Infantry regiments, 40 Naval Infantry brigades of 5 10 battalions, formed from surplus ships' crews. 5 brigades were awarded Gvardy status. Numerous smaller units. The military situation demanded the deployment of large numbers of Marines on land fronts, so the Naval Infantry contributed to the defense of Moscow, Leningrad, Odessa, Sevastopol, Stalingrad, Novorossiysk, Kerch. The Naval Infantry conducted over 114 landings, most of which were carried out by platoons and companies. In general, however, Naval Infantry served as regular infantry, without any amphibious training. They conducted 4 major operations, 2 during the Battle of the Kerch Peninsula, 1 during the Caucasus Campaign and 1 as part of the landing at Moonsund, in the Baltic. During the war, 5 brigades and 2 battalions of naval infantry were awarded Guard status. 9 brigades and 6 battalions were awarded decorations, and many were given honorary titles. The title Hero of the Soviet Union was bestowed on 122 members of naval infantry units. The Soviet experience in amphibious warfare in World War II contributed to the development of Soviet combined arms operations. Many members of the naval infantry were parachute-trained, conducting more drops and successful parachute operations than the Soviet airborne troops. The naval infantry was disbanded in 1947, with some units being transferred to the Coastal Defense Forces. In 1961, the naval infantry was reformed and became one of the active combat services of the Navy. Each fleet was assigned a marine unit of regiment size. The naval infantry received amphibious versions of standard armored fighting vehicle, including tanks used by the Soviet Army. By 1989, the naval infantry numbered 18,000 Marines, organized into a Marine Division and 4 independent Marine brigades. 55th Marine Division, at Vladivostok, 63rd Guards Kirkenskaya Brigade at Pechenga, 175th Brigade, at Tumany in the north, 336th Guards Brigade at Baltiysk, 810th Brigade, at Sevastopol. By the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Navy had over 80 landing ships, as well as 2 Ivan Rogov-class landing ships. The latter could transport 1 infantry battalion with 40 armored vehicles and their landing craft. At 75 units, the Soviet Union had the world's largest inventory of combat air cushion assault craft. In addition, many of the 2,500 vessels of the Soviet merchant fleet could offload weapons and supplies during amphibious landings. On November 18, 1990, on the eve of the Paris summit where the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty and the Vienna Document on Confidence and Security Building Measures was signed, Soviet data were presented under the so-called initial data exchange. This showed a rather sudden emergence of 3 so-called coastal defense divisions, along with 3 artillery brigades regiments, subordinate to the Soviet Navy, which had previously been unknown as such to NATO. Much of the equipment, which was commonly understood to be treaty limited, was declared to be part of the Naval Infantry. The Soviet argument was that the CFE excluded all naval forces, including its permanently land-based components. The Soviet government eventually became convinced that its position could not be maintained. A proclamation of the Soviet government on July 14, 1991, which was later adopted by its successor states, provided that all treaty-limited equipment assigned to naval infantry or coastal defense forces would count against the total treaty entitlement. Heads of the Soviet naval forces Commanders of naval forces of the RSFSR Vasily Mikhailovich Oltfeter, Yevgeny Andreevich Berens, Alexander Vasilievich Nimitz. Commander-in-Chief's Assistant for Naval Affairs Commanders-in-Chief of the Naval Forces of the USSR Eduard Samoilovich Pantsitsansky, Vyacheslav Ivanovich Sov, Admiral Adamovich Muklevich, Fleet Flag Officer 1st Rank Vladimir Mitrofanovich Orlov, Fleet Flag Officer 2nd Rank Lev Mikhailovich Gorlo Acting, Fleet Flag Officer 1st Rank Mikhail Vladimirovich Viktorov. People's Commissars for the USSR Navy Army Commissar 1st Rank Pyotr Alexandrovich Smirnov, Army Commander 1st Rank Mikhail Petrovich Frinovsky, Admiral Nikolai Gerasimovich Gstsev. Commanders-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy Fleet Admiral Nikolai Gerasimovich Gstsev, Admiral Ivan Stepanovich Yumashev, Fleet Admiral of the Soviet Union Nikolai Gerasimovich Gstsev, second term, Fleet Admiral of the Soviet Union Sergei Georgievich Gorshkov, considered the officer most responsible for reforming the Soviet Navy, Fleet Admiral Vladimir Nikolaevich Krenevin. See also, Soviet Naval Aviation, Soviet Naval Infantry, Naval History of World War II, 1966 Soviet Submarine Global Circumnavigation, List of ships of the Soviet Navy, List of USSR Navy flags, Morskaya Aviatsiya World War II Soviet Naval Air Service, List of Russian admirals. References. Bibliography, Goldstein, Lyle. Zhukov, Yuri. A Tale of Two Fleets, A Russian Perspective on the 1973 Naval Standoff in the Mediterranean. Naval War College Review. Goldstein, Lyle. John Hattendorf. Zhukov, Yuri. The Cold War at Sea, An International Appraisal. Journal of Strategic Studies. ISSN 0140-2390, Gorshkov, Sergei Georgievich. Red Star Rising at Sea, Nilsson, Thomas. Kudryk, Igor. Nikitin, Alexand. Report 2, 1996 The Russian Northern Fleet. Oslo St. Petersburg, Bellona Foundation. ISBN 82-993138-5-6. Chapter 8, Nuclear Submarine Accidents. Aberg, James. Uncovering Soviet Disasters. New York, New York, Random House. ISBN 0-394-56095-7. Roa, Jawan Kortara Gen, and Mikhail S. Monikov, Stalin's Ocean-Going Fleet, Soviet Naval Strategy and Shipbuilding Programs, 1935–1953, Sontag, Sherry. Drew, Christopher. Drew, Annette Lawrence. Blind Man's Bluff, The Untold Story of American Submarine Espionage. Harper. ISBN 0-06-103004-X. External links, Russian Navy, globalsecurity.org page on the Soviet Navy. Admiral Gorshkov and the Soviet Navy, Soviet submarines, Red Fleet, flags and streamers, warship listing, Russian Navy weapons, all Soviet warships a complete ship list, all Soviet submarines a complete ship list, understanding Soviet naval developments.